This is Bill Newman, WHMP.
We are joined in the studio by Susan Naimark. She is the author of The Education of a White Parent, Wrestling with Race and Opportunity in the Boston Public Schools. She will be doing a reading, having question and answer period, and taking your questions and having a conversation tonight about her work and her book at Food for Thought Books in Amherst at 7 o'clock from 7 to 8:30. That's at Food for Thought Books in Amherst this evening. Susan Naimark, The Education of a White Parent. You have been a member of the Boston School Committee. You've worked with many nonprofit community development organizations. You have worked to create responsive community institutions. The Education of a White Parent. It's a provocative title. Tell us how you became educated and what did you learn?
Well, how long do we have? It was a long process. It basically is my story about having my kids go through the Boston Public Schools, and I sent them there somewhat naively as a parent living in the city, and that's, you send your kids to the public schools. That's what I thought. And the education was my learning about how different it was for me as a white middle-class parent sending my kids to those schools compared to the majority of families, which are families of color and tend to be more low income, and that there was a lot working in my favor and my kids' favor that I wasn't necessarily aware of going into it. So it was a long learning process.
What was working in your kids' favor that was not working for, or that the other kids in their classes didn't have?
Well, I think that we like to think we're a colorblind society these days, but I think there's still a lot of bias that goes on, and that it's all of us, and we don't think we're racist anymore because that's, in a lot of environments anyway, we're more likely to think that, that's a thing of the past, but that we all, parents, teachers, leadership in the schools, all do things that play out differently, and that they react differently and act differently with kids of color versus white kids. I can give an example if you want.
Sure, I would like that.
Yeah. So my kids went to an elementary school where it was maybe 15% white, and the activities in that school that were selective, like choosing kids to work on the newspaper and be in the chorus, student council, was almost all white kids. And when we asked the teachers, and many of the teachers were teachers of color, so how do you choose kids for that? They got pretty defensive, and it kind of came down to who looks motivated, who's kind of enthusiastic, and that there's a lot of things behind that, what promise looks like in a kid. And kids who are, taking care of siblings because their parents work late or aren't dressed in a middle-class way. There's just a lot of things that send messages to us as adults about who has promise and who deserves to do stuff that, in fact, would benefit all kids. That's just one example.
You sent your kids to the public school. Did you ever give any thought to trying to send your kids to a private school?
No. People ask that all the time.
Sorry, I'm a boring interviewer, but I do the best I can here.
No, it is a question that comes up. And, I never stepped foot in a private school before I had my kids. So it just was not something that occurred to me.
Which neighborhood in Boston, what part of Boston was this school?
It was in Roxbury, in Grove Hall, which is sort of the border between Roxbury and Dorchester, in the heart of the black community, is what people would say. I lived in Jamaica Plain, which is a racially mixed community.
So were you hoping to give your children sort of a multicultural experience via the means of the public school system? Because if you're living in Roxbury, if you know anything about Roxbury, you do know that it's hugely racially diverse, to say the least.
Absolutely. That was an important piece of sending my kids to the schools, was having that diversity and experiencing what I certainly didn't growing up.
So are you glad to have been educated as a white parent into what that actually meant when the boots were in the ground in the school, when your kids were actually exposed to that?
Absolutely. And my kids, too. I mean, they're not as active in things, but one is and one isn't. But I think they recognize that they themselves got an education that was more than the academics, and that has value in the world.
Tell us what other lessons you learned. The Education of a White Parent is the name of your book, Wrestling with Race and Opportunity in the Boston Public Schools. You've mentioned the subtle, maybe not so subtle, indicia that teachers may use to recognize promise in a kid that may have, or I think you were saying does have some racist genesis or foundation? What other lessons?
Well, I saw the parent involvement, and this is still to this day. My kids went through the schools, a while ago now, 20 years, where the white middle class parents tend to be very involved, and parents of color not so much. And what I saw was the way that we, as white parents, made it intimidating for parents of color. So we think we're just in there doing the right thing, raising money and advocating for our own kids, but in fact, we're doing things in a way that maybe helped our kids but didn't help all kids.
Do you think your kids got a decent education in the Boston public schools?
They did. And, I do have to...
I read a lot decades ago about white flight from Boston, attributed at least in significant part to the court's ordering of desegregation. Bring us up to date. How did that play out?
It was a very disruptive process. And when people ask today, did it really improve the schools? You could question whether it really did. But what's happening now, so we no longer have racial quotas, but the legacy of that is that there's school choice where people can choose any elementary school within a zone. So the schools are more racially integrated than they would be otherwise if we were just in neighborhood schools. And I think there's a value to that for everybody. And now, up to date, is that there's kind of a gentrification of the schools going on, where there's, white families moving back to the city, want to use the public schools, and there's this whole dynamic where, as soon as they have babies, they'll start researching as a group which schools to go to and kind of go as a group and kind of take over. And I think there's it's a little problematic because the schools may turn around, but not for the kids that have been there all along, because these parents will be very active and they'll do the fundraising and then they'll decide how that money gets spent, and it may or may not help all kids.
Could you read us a couple of passages from your book?
Sure. I could start with the opening. This was kind of my point of entry, where I was kind of naive. You live in Boston, you send your kids to the schools there, and so I went to sign my son up. This was in 1985, so the court-ordered assignment process was still in place. So this is the opening of Chapter 1. Sign them up for the Kennedy School. They need whites there. The school secretary, a middle-aged white woman, barely looked up from the list of elementary schools spread on the counter between us. In my first interaction with the Boston Public Schools, I couldn't tell whether her statement was a suggestion or a directive, and I certainly couldn't fathom why she thought this piece of information would be a selling point to a parent registering a child to attend kindergarten in the fall.
When did this racial assignment system come to an end? And what do you mean exactly, or could you clarify for our listeners what you mean by that racial assignment system?
So the schools, there were actually many lawsuits by the black community looking for equity and quality in the schools. And the one that many people know was filed by the NAACP in 1965, and it resulted in the federal court in 1974 ordering the schools to bus kids to desegregate. It was a very disruptive process, met with a lot of violence in a couple of white communities, and simmered down after a year or two. But that assignment process, where there were racial quotas, there were sort of choices of schools within zones that were set up to be kind of to get kids from different neighborhoods mixing with each other. That was in process. That assignment process was in place. Oh boy, now you're pressing me. It's into the 90s at some point that it was challenged in the courts and dropped, or maybe even, in the 90s.
I think there's a ring. You hear the term racial assignment and quotas, and I think most people bristle at that kind of a suggestion that that's a way to run any system, much less a school system. You say that actually there was some benefit from it, and you were reluctant to see that structure dismantled. Why?
Because I believe that the kids of color were still not getting an adequate education. And when I was on the school committee and we had some community meetings to look at dropping the racial quotas in the student assignment, it was interesting what I heard because for the most part, many white parents said, well, just give us back our neighborhood schools. We will make them work if they don't work. But I heard a different story from families of color over and over again, which was they didn't have the confidence that giving them back their schools, that they had the political power to make them work. And so it was like, make them work first, and then we'd be happy to go to neighborhood schools. And so I think there's still a big discrepancy in both the political power that communities of color, families of color have, and the perception of their ability to make change in the system.
Do you see the integration of the school systems or any school system as a priority and as a benefit to the system and to the students, as well as the faculty and the teachers and the staff?
I have no doubt that it's a benefit. You know, when you look at demographic data, I think they say the year 2042, 30 years from now, is when this country is going to become majority people of color, and that we all need to learn to get along, and we don't if schools are segregated. So I think there's a benefit. Priority is a tricky one because there's so many priorities in terms of making schools work. Honestly, my first priority, I think, would be funding, because when you look at what kids need to do well, we're just so far below where we should be.
Do you believe in neighborhood schools?
I think they're a good thing. I don't have a problem with them. I just think it is very loaded in Boston. I can't speak for elsewhere, and that, when you look at people who have choice and send their kids to private schools, they're not worried about neighborhood. They're worried about building a community and getting what they need for their kids, and I think that's more important.
Can you read us another passage from the book, The Education of a White Parent, Wrestling with Race and Opportunity in the Boston Public Schools? The author is Susan Naimark, and she will be at Food for Thought Books in Amherst this evening at 7 o'clock. Can we hear a little more?
Sure. So I thought I earlier read from the beginning. I thought I'd read a couple paragraphs from the end. So this is after, my kids have grown up. I'm writing this book. I'm talking about race. And I thought, let me interview them. They're adults now and see kind of what they think. And my older son has kind of fallen closer into the fold in terms of his interest in these kind of issues. My younger son's a little bit more of the contrarian. And so when I said, so what do you think, Jess?